Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Brown Bag Speakers Forum. My name is Paul. I'm with the Albany Library. And this program is a monthly series. It's a co-presentation with the Albany YMCA and also local cable channel KALB. So Mary's going to tell you about today's speaker. But first, I want to tell you about some upcoming events. On May 9th, we have Joe Lurie of International House at UC Berkeley. He'll be discussing his work on cross-cultural misperceptions. He was recently featured on the Commonwealth Club. Here's a little blurb about Joe. Inspired by a West African proverb that says, "The stranger sees only what he knows," Joe Lurie shares a feast of cross-cultural stories and misadventures, exploring the deeper cultural messages that escape people who hear largely what they're used to hearing and see mostly what they're used to seeing. Lurie reveals how cultural filters distort perceptions of others in the worlds of immigration, diplomacy, and business. So we're excited about that. That's next month. So in June, we have the Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes, whose mission is to offer programs that target mature students, not necessarily well-served by standard continuing education programs. And that's in June. So I also want to tell everyone that this program today is going to be recorded for KALB for rebroadcast on the cable channel, 10 a.m. on Saturday and 4 p.m. on Sunday. And it'll also be on their YouTube channel. So thanks to Jeremy and Jack from KALB. So now here's Mary to tell you about today's program.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. We are so happy to have with us today Lawrence Rinder, who is the director of the University of California Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, a position that he has held since 2008. During his tenure, he has successfully guided BAMPFA through the campaign for its $112 million new building. And if you haven't seen it, it's spectacular. Supervised the selection of Diller, Scofidio, Renfro as design architects, and worked directly with the architectural team to identify a sustainable design concept for the project. His curatorial contributions while serving as BAMPFA director include organizing the widely praised experimental exhibition, The Possible, in 2014 with David Wilson, the first mid-career survey of Barry McGee in 2012 with Dina Beard, Create in 2011 with Matthew Higgs, Galaxy, 100 or so stars visible to the naked eye in 2009, and launching the popular multidisciplinary performance program Late, Friday nights at Banff. So please give a warm welcome to Lawrence Rinder.
Thank you, Mary and Paul. It's a pleasure to be here in Albany. Just so I have a sense of who I'm talking to, how many of you have been to BAMPFA at some point in your life? Okay, all right. How many of you have been to the new downtown BAMPFA? Okay, pretty good, pretty good. The front row needs some work, but well, hopefully by the end of the talk, we'll have convinced you that it's a good thing to do. Before I talk about the new BAMPFA, it's important to talk a little bit about the old BAMPFA to understand our history and sort of where we've come from, and to appreciate also some of the kind of the long-standing continuity for the arts at UC Berkeley. The Art Museum at UC Berkeley was actually the third building built on campus after North and South Hall. The third building was the library, Bacon Library and Art Museum, built in 1881. And that's what it looked like. And apparently it existed until 1961 when it was torn down. It was funded through various sources, including from the state of California, and is named after a fellow named Bacon, Henry Bacon, who I think made his money somehow in the gold rush, as so many people did back then. The building was a combination of library and art museum, but the date of its founding, 1881, does make it the oldest still operating art museum on the West Coast. So apparently Woodward Gardens, have you heard of Woodward Gardens? It was sort of an amusement park over in what is now the Mission District of San Francisco. Apparently they had an art museum even earlier than 1881, but that doesn't exist anymore. So the UC Berkeley Art Museum still exists. It has a different name. It's now BAMPFA, but this is where it all began. And our collection actually dates back to the founding of the Bacon Library and Museum. This painting by Albert Bierstadt was given by Henry Bacon on the occasion of the founding of the museum. So if you look at the accession date of this painting, it's 1881. We have been collecting art for a very long time. It's interesting to note that at the time this was collected, it would have been considered contemporary art. It was made about 8 years before the founding of the Bacon Library and Museum. It's obviously a fantastic painting, Yosemite Winter Scene, by one of the great American 19th century landscape painters. We've been collecting art from many cultures around the world for a very, very long time. As far as I can determine, the earliest gifts of Asian art were made in 1919 when we received a very, very large collection of Japanese prints, including this work by Hokusai. It's from the Views of Mount Fuji series. And I think there were hundreds of prints that came in this gift. So from the very early days, we have been what is known as an encyclopedic museum. And that is to say that our collections and programs represent a very broad swath of cultures and time periods as well. So if you can think about sort of the local museum ecology, we're more akin to the fine arts museums, the De Young and the Legion of Honor, than we are to, say, SF MoMA, because of the breadth and depth of our collections. The other encyclopedic museums in the Bay Area, besides us and the Fine Arts Museums, really the only other one that I'm aware of is the Cantor Museum at Stanford, and we're the only encyclopedic museum that is accessible on BART. The others, you can try taking BART, but then you have to walk away. So we have a really unique role to play in the culture of the Bay Area as kind of the go-to place if you want to see old master prints and drawings, if you want to see contemporary video art, and Ming and Qing Dynasty Chinese painting. So if you're really looking for that kind of breadth and depth, BAMPFA is the place to go. So as I said, Bacon Hall was torn down in 1961, and at some point before that, and I don't know why or when, it stopped serving as the museum or gallery of UC Berkeley. As of 1934, this building at the center of campus, it's just off Sproul Plaza, was turned into the University Art Gallery, as it was called then. It's actually a building that was originally designed to be a powerhouse, a power station for the university. It was designed by John Galen Howard, who is the very illustrious architect of many of the grand buildings on campus, and this is indeed a rather grand building. It has mosaics that were added later. I think it opened in the early 20th century, around 1906, sticks in my mind, but the murals were added in the WPA period. Helen Bruton is one of the artists, and I forget the name of the other. Anyway, they're allegorical murals about the arts. You can see music and poetry, and then I think on the other side is sculpture and dance. And if you're interested in these mosaics, you can go and see them today. You can go onto campus and see at least the outside of this building. The inside is closed off. Unfortunately, there are seismic issues in this building, and so it's no longer accessible to the public. This building functioned as the university gallery from 1934 until 1970, when the museum moved to its new building, which I'll get to in a minute, in 1970. So in 1968, the museum expanded in a very significant way, in a way that was to become, I think, really foundational for who we've become and our uniqueness in the international field of museum practice. And that was when the folks, Sheldon Renan and Henry Langlois from the Cinémathèque Française, came to Peter Seltz and said, who was the founding director of the museum, and said, how would you like to have a film archive and cinematheque as part of your museum? Henry Langlois had already gone to, and Sheldon Renan had already gone to SF MoMA and the Oakland Museum with this proposal, and were turned down at both of those institutions. And so we were their third, but I'm glad their final place that they went to say, would you like an archive and cinematheque? So Peter Seltz, who had come from New York MoMA, where they had a film program, agreed. And I think he agreed in part because he had seen how that would work. He had a precedent for understanding the role of film in an art museum. And the particular role of film that was being offered by this model of the Cinémathèque Française, which is basically stands on three legs: collection, presentation, and discussion or education. Those are sort of the three key ingredients of the Cinémathèque and archive concept developed by Henri Langlois at the Cinémathèque Française in Paris, and that is what they sought to establish at the Berkeley Art Museum. So here you have Fritz Lang talking to a group of students, probably 1968. This is probably not physically at the art museum because the PFA, what's called Pacific Film Archive, didn't move in physically into the art museum until 1970. Before that, it was at Wheeler Hall. Maybe some of you even went to the screenings that were held at that time. But even from the very beginning, you can see that conversation and dialogue about film was an important part of the idea of the Pacific Film Archive, not just screening films, but also learning and thinking and discussing, debating films. In 1970, the museum moved to a brand new building on Bancroft Way, designed by Mario Chiampi, a local architect. And at the time, I think it was the largest contemporary art museum in the country, 100,000 square feet, very, very large for a university museum in particular. And I think it really shows the ambition that the campus had for this institution, that it was created on such an enormous scale. The building, as I'm sure you know, is very innovative and kind of experimental in terms of the design, massive concrete double helix spiral that I think was very inspiring to a lot of artists and curators, and I think we did a lot of great work in it. Ultimately, it was determined to be seismically unsound, and that necessitated the need to move on. I saw some correspondence early on in my tenure as director where Clark Kerr had written to someone about the founding of this, or the building of this building, kind of to justify the expenditure of building this thing. And one of his comments was, we're having a hard time recruiting chemists and physicists from Switzerland. They don't understand why they'd leave Zurich or Basel to come to the West Coast where there's no culture. So we need a world-class museum. So the museum, at least at this point, was supported, and the construction of this building as a kind of recruitment strategy to get high-level science faculty to come to Berkeley. Of course, it had other ancillary benefits as well, educating our community and the students and whatnot. But times have changed, and I think we have a different set of goals at this point. So the museum continued to develop in the direction of an encyclopedic collection and program, and over the course of the years really deepened its strength in a number of key areas. One of those key areas, which just occurs to me now, I forgot to illustrate in this PowerPoint, but I don't think it'll need an illustration for most of you, is Hans Hofmann, who actually gave a substantial amount of the funds needed to build the Bancroft Way building. He gave those funds in the early 60s. And also gave 50 of his own paintings to the museum. So that collection of Hans Hofmann paintings, who of course is one of the great masters of American abstract expressionism, served to build a core strength in the area of abstract expressionism, making our collection of abstract expressionist painting one of the most important in the country. But another area where we quickly developed a very core strength is in the area of Chinese painting. I mentioned before that the earliest Asian works came into the collection in the early 20th century, and those were Japanese prints. But then in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and even until very recently, we have benefited very, very strongly from the presence in Berkeley of Professor James Cahill, who for decades was considered really the preeminent scholar of Chinese painting. He was a professor at Cal for over 30 years. He was briefly even the director of the museum, and was very committed to teaching from actual works of art. And so he collected a lot of paintings that he would use in his classes. He was collecting at a time when a lot of this material was very undervalued during the Cultural Revolution, for example, when China was sort of erasing its own history very actively, and a lot of this material was being sent out of the country, and Professor Cahill was able to, first of all, recognize what it was and understand the difference between a forgery and an authentic piece and so on. And so he collected an amazing number of important works, many of which he gave to BAMPFA, and his He passed away last year. His family and descendants are still very generous to us. Just a few months ago, Sarah Cahill, his daughter, gave us really a masterpiece, a Yuan Dynasty painting that will add tremendously to our collection. In any event, this is one of the pieces in the Cahill collection, a piece by Wang Jian. This is a 17th century painting. Our collection of Ming and Qing Dynasty ink paintings is one of the most important in the country. We've just opened what we call the James Cahill Asian Art Study Center, where all of this material will be both kept and made accessible to scholars, students, and by appointment, even the general public. Another one of the programmatic developments at the museum was the creation of what we call the Matrix program in 1978. And what's called Matrix is basically an ongoing program of small-scale exhibitions of primarily contemporary art, but not exclusively contemporary. The idea behind this program, it originated in the 1970s, and the people who thought of it came up with the idea because at that time, their perception was that art was changing much more quickly. So it used to be maybe in the 19th century that you would have a new movement every 20 years. And then in the early 20th century, movements would change maybe every 10 years. Well, by the time you get to the 70s, you had movements changing every year or every 6 months. You'd have onto a new thing. The problem is that museums take about 2 years to organize a typical show. And so museums were having a hard time keeping up with changes in contemporary art. So the concept behind Matrix was to introduce a strand of programming that would be able to respond more quickly to changes in the culture, where you would have smaller exhibitions, maybe only a handful of works. They would be in a small gallery on a relatively small budget. And with the curator having a great deal of independence so that they'd be able to sort of respond to new ideas that might challenge the conventional wisdom about what art is or what's beautiful and so on. So this idea began at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut, one of the country's oldest museums. It's interesting that they took the leap into this sort of out-of-the-box thinking. The director at that time, Jim Elliott, left the Wadsworth Atheneum within about a year of coming up with the Matrix idea, brought it with him to Berkeley, and so for that reason, there are 2 Matrix programs in the country, one in Hartford and one here. There's no formal relationship, but they happen to have the same name and more or less the same mission. At this point, we've done almost 250 Matrix exhibitions over the course of the past, 30 years that the program has existed, ranging from completely unknown artists who no one's ever heard of to really celebrated people like Andy Warhol, Willem de Kooning, and so on. So the program is interesting that it really can serve to introduce new work by established artists or new work by artists you've never heard of. This particular show is a sculptural installation by Chinese artist Sai Guo Zhang, who was not very well known in the United States when this show was put on in 2004, but he recently had a major retrospective at the Guggenheim. He's now widely considered to be, along with Ai Weiwei, probably one of the most important and prominent contemporary Chinese artists. The Pacific Film Archive, which as of 1968 was really a fully absorbed into the Berkeley, what was then called the University Art Museum, is now BAMPFA, is essentially the film department of the museum. And I described before what its nature was: collecting, presenting, and education. So the collecting part of the Pacific Film Archive continued to develop to the point where now we have over 17,000 films and videos from all over the world. They go back to the very beginnings of cinema, so you can find very early silent films from all over the world, up through contemporary Hollywood films and experimental films. We have the largest collection of Japanese cinema outside of Japan, and indicative of that is this piece, Written on the Wind, not Written on the Wind, Nausicaa in the Valley of the Winds. We also own Written on the Wind. This is the Miyazaki great animated cartoon. Very large holdings of Chinese cinema, Soviet cinema, and many other areas. And we are now in the new building doing 450 screenings a year and you do the math, you can figure out that's more than one a day. So it's really quite an active program of film screenings. One of the other things that really developed as an important feature of our institution are the public programs. You know, a museum and film archive is not just where you put the art on the wall and then, you know, say, well, there it is, and go away. No, you have conversations about it. You have dialogue. And we really put a lot of emphasis on in-person presentations for both art and film. This is someone you probably recognize, Clint Eastwood, speaking in our PFA theater in 2010. Something like a third to a half of all the film screenings have a live in-person presenter talking about the film. It could be the director, it could be one of the actors, a cinematographer, and so on. And most of our art exhibitions also have many of the artists speaking, perhaps professors from campus, and that sort of thing. When I arrived as director in 2008, one of the challenges that I saw was that the Bancroft Way building, which I'm sure you all remember, had that kind of cavernous central atrium, which was very exciting when something was going on in it, but kind of deadly when there was nothing going on in it, which is most of the time. So it really became a priority for us to figure out how to enliven that space. And so we came up with a series called Late, where on an almost monthly basis, we would have evening performances in the space, and we would have guest curators come in to select the musicians, but it could also be dancers, poets, all sorts of things happened in the space. One of our, I would say, most celebrated guest programmers was Sarah Cahill, who happens to be James Cahill's daughter, who, as you may know, is really one of the country's most remarkable specialists in contemporary music, new music. She has strong connections to the very lively community of composers coming out of Mills College. She knows a lot of musicians around, and so we hired her to organize this series, and she was very adept at getting really internationally renowned performers to come in and for virtually no money do incredible concerts. And among the favorites was Terry Riley, who came almost every year between 2009 and when we left, 2015. So he'd have the grand piano set up in the middle of the space, and we'd have 600 to 800 people kind of sitting in a circle around him, and it was just one of those points where you just thought, only in Berkeley, this is really... is just so good. I mean, the highest level quality, but also there was something a little out there about it. You know, he'd start playing, you just never know when he was going to stop. He'd just play for hours. It was really good. So, as I said, that building was determined to have seismic issues. So after the Loma Prieta earthquake, some of you may remember that, 1989, it took them until 1996 to complete a seismic survey of the campus buildings to determine their sort of seaworthiness. And our building was determined to be very poor, which is the lowest grade of seismicity possible. So there was an interim seismic remediation that was done. And if you go to the museum, you'll see the big steel columns that appear to be holding it up. They are holding it up, but that was not adequate for the long term. It was just a temporary fix. So it was determined that we either had to do a permanent restoration of that building or move. It was determined that the cost of retrofitting that building would be in the tens of millions of dollars, and it would also permanently change the nature of the building. So that central atrium would have had to be carved up with shear walls, and it wouldn't be the same thing. So for a variety of reasons, it was determined that the best strategy would be to move to a different site and start from scratch. And around that time, the university identified this site at the intersection of Oxford and Center Streets as the best site for the new Berkeley Art Museum Pacific Film Archive. It's a site that since 1939 has been the home of the UC Press. So this building opened in 1939. It is the only WPA building in the UC system, so it is kind of a design perspective and culturally kind of unique in the UC system. But interestingly, designed by the same firm, Marsden and Hurd, that designed the Magnus collection, which is just 2 blocks away, which also was a 1939 printing plant designed by the same firm. I don't know why they needed two, but they 2 blocks away from each other, but there you have it. The style is Deco Moderne. It's sort of the last gasp, if you will, of the Art Deco style, and you can see some of the features of that are sort of the streamlined detailing around the windows. On the interior, there are some really wonderful chrome light fixtures, particularly in the entrance, the staff entrance, which is, let's see, laser pointer here. This is now the staff entrance. There's some beautiful chrome fixtures and also a beautiful spiral staircase in there that makes one think of oneself as sort of Auntie Mame every time you go to work, going up this grand staircase. It's very exciting. But, you know, it really was not such an exciting building for this prominent location, for downtown Berkeley, especially when that whole frontage on Center Street, as I'm sure you'll remember, was basically an impenetrable wall of concrete and glass block that you couldn't see into. It was like having, you know, half the block of the main pedestrian street of downtown Berkeley having the Berlin Wall running along it. It was very chilling. And the building had sort of been let go, particularly after the printing folks abandoned it, which they did around 2000, something like that. Around 2010. And you know, they moved on, and so the building was abandoned. It was occupied by squatters who had really trashed the interior. Every square inch of the interior was covered with graffiti, and so the original concept was to tear it down. That was what everyone wanted to do and intended to do for a number of years, and to build on that site this very large building designed by Toyo Ito, a Japanese architect. So when I was started in 2008, July of 2008, I took the job with the intention of completing a $200 million capital campaign to fund the construction of this building and to build it. This building, designed by Toyo Ito, would have increased the square footage by about 40%. So the building on Bancroft Way was about 100,000 square feet. This was 140,000 square feet, so a very substantial increase in the amount of programmatic space. 3-story building made of molded steel, so solid steel. All those sort of curtain-like forms are actually steel that would have been manufactured in a shipyard. They're the only people who know how to take big plates of steel and create these complex curves. If you happen to be at MoMA in New York in the next couple weeks or months, the model for this is part of a show there on contemporary Japanese architecture. But what happened was that 2 months after I started as the director, the Great Recession came around, so September of 2008. And it didn't take too long for me and others to realize that we were not going to raise $200 million soon enough, because the thing that was driving us was not just that we wanted a fancy new museum or that we wanted to move. It was that we had a life safety issue. We were sort of racing the clock to get out of that building before there was a major earthquake. And after the Great Recession, or in the midst of it, I didn't feel that that we could move fast enough. And so I had to let Toyo Ito go. I cut the budget in half, so from $200 million to $100 million, which is still a lot of money, but we had to do something or close. And so we started from scratch, and we did a fast-track architecture competition to get a new architect, and made the strategic decision to use the printing plant instead of tearing it down, with the thought that that would save us money rather than having to demolish it. We could use its structural parts. The office building alone is 10,000 square feet of perfectly usable office space, which actually fit perfectly the amount of staff that we have. We have about 65 staff members. So that was the idea. So the architecture competition that we ran in early 2009 asked for proposals from various architects for what would they do in repurposing this existing building. And we had a number. This is what it looked like on the inside. You can see all the graffiti and I mean, kind of wonderful, very dramatic, but pretty wrecked. So the some of the things that we were looking for in an architecture firm. We wanted a firm that had previous experience designing a freestanding museum, so a museum that actually stood on its own 2 feet and was an autonomous building, and which is, you'd think that would be a given in an architecture competition for a new building, but in fact, Toyo Ito had never designed a museum before, so he didn't have that experience, which might explain why he designed the building with curved walls made of solid steel. Anyway, the firm that we ultimately hired, Diller, Scofidio, Renfro, had, within the past several years before we hired them, opened this wonderful building in Boston Harbor, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. So with this building, the ICA Boston expanded by something like 10 times the square footage that they had, and really made themselves, through the kind of physical expression of this building, a major player, if you will, in the Boston cultural community. And we went and visited, of course, and talked to the curators and the director, and found that the building actually worked very well for them, and that the firm had stayed on budget, and so on. The other thing we were looking for, though, was a firm that had prior experience in taking an existing structure or architectural form and repurposing it. And Diller, Scofidio, Renfro had some very good examples of this kind of experience. They were the firm that worked on the redesign of this abandoned railroad track on the west side of New York that they transformed into the High Line, which is now probably the most successful, or in any event popular, urban park project of the 20th and early 21st centuries. It's almost a victim of its own success. If you go there now, you can barely move once you're up there. It's just insane how many people want to be on this abandoned railroad track. But some of the things that they did that we liked, the kind of the design features, was the way that they really used the existing materials in very fresh and inventive ways. They sort of maintained the historical textures of this railroad track, and turned these things that had previously been sort of forgotten elements into really wonderful, sometimes humorous, sometimes sensual, sometimes practical features of this park. You can see, for example, the benches there on the right actually slide up and down on sections of the old railroad track. The landscaping that they ultimately did for the park incorporates many of the species of what we would consider weeds that had kind of taken a liking to this space in the years that it was abandoned. So they have a wonderful kind of fresh way of thinking about lots of different things, and we like that for our project. So this is the building as it looks now, and you can see that we really preserved the basic structure of the printing plant. So you have the office building, the 3-story office building on the right, and then on the left, that sort of low-slung 1-story space, which is where the printing presses were. So that was kind of the industrial part of the building. And essentially the only thing that we did, at least from the outside, on that Center Street facade is opening up those the windows and taking out the glass block and making those windows transparent, which helped us to achieve one of the things that was really key for us, which was to make the museum as open to the public as we possibly could. We believe that museums need to be part of the fabric of life in a community. We want people to feel welcome and engaged, and we want people to know that we're there. We want it to be visible. One of the problems with the Bancroft Way building was that if you could find the building, you might not be able to find the entrance. I mean, it was all very sort of hidden away. It was like a concrete bunker. You couldn't see inside of it. It was very off-putting to the public. And so we went the opposite direction. We said, make the building expressive of our identity as an art and film museum, allow people to see into the museum, and make the experience of being in the city very close to the experience of being on the street. And I think they achieved that very well. Not only by opening up those windows, but also by making an enormous sign that says Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, which I think was accidentally made twice as large as it was supposed to be, but no one has said anything, so I don't know. It's really wonderful. And we also marked the main entrance with this enormous cantilever. As I mentioned before, one of the problems with the old building is that you couldn't find the entrance. Well, you could, but some people actually never did. So we decided to very clearly mark the entrance by having this cantilever sort of jut out over the front door. And if you've been there, you know that that cantilever contains one of the ends of the cafe. So you can actually go up into that space and you have a wonderful view in one direction to the campus and in the other direction to downtown Berkeley, which I think really is very symbolic of our role as a hinge between campus and community. So now we're kind of going around the building. You can see on the left there, that's the view we had before. You can see up into the cantilever, that the view into the cafe. And from this angle, you can see that the cafe is just sort of the southernmost piece of a form. You could call it almost a sculptural form that wraps around the back of the administration building and then is expressed at the north side as the theater, the large film theater. So this design concept is really key to Diller, Scofidio, Renfro's idea of how to take the printing plant and expand it so that it had enough square footage for our program. And they did that in two ways. One, by excavating the entire footprint of the printing plant area, and the second was by adding this form, which really is like almost an autonomous sculpture that drapes over the printing plant. And the kind of the sculptural expression of it both echoes the Deco-Moderne style, that sort of curvilinear, chrome type affect of machine modernity, but expresses it in a very 21st century way. It's clearly from a different time, but I think it relates to the aesthetic of the 1939 Deco-Moderne in interesting ways. And now we're sort of gone fully around the block, and we're facing the building from the east, looking across Oxford Street, and you can see on the left the administration building and then the expression of that new sculptural form as it drapes down and becomes the theater. So one of the challenges that the architects had was, our requirement that they express our identity as a film and art museum so that people going by would know who we were. It's relatively easy to do that with art. You can make big windows that you can look through and actually see art through the windows. You can't do that with film. You can't put a window on the side of a film theater. It sort of defeats the purpose. So they came up with a number of interesting ways of expressing this sort of film identity. One was to make the theater legible as a theater from the outside. So they sort of expressed the slope of the seats on the left and that the space of the screen on the north side, as we'll see at the end of the slideshow, actually has a 30-foot wide LED screen on the outside of the theater so that you get that kind of sense of the space belonging to cinema. So this is what the inside of the museum looks like now. Remember the slide I showed you when it was all a mess with the graffiti? It cleaned up very nicely. As you probably noticed if you were paying attention, there was actually a bit of time when there was nothing there. It was just a hole in the ground because we realized that in order to excavate it, it would be cheaper to take it apart, take it off-site, clean the steel, and then reassemble it. That would be cheaper than holding the whole thing up while we dug down below. So indeed, it was taken apart and reassembled. That part of the building, the area where the printing presses were, consists of 3 north-facing skylit bays. You can think of them like a typical factory, a skylit factory. And it's very dramatic and at the same time very beautiful. You can see at the top of the skylight there the way the structural steel curves. This is, from a structural perspective, unnecessary and probably it cost more money to have that elegant curve in there. You could just make the steel beams at a right angle. But it's interesting that even in this industrial space in the middle of the Great Depression, they sort of went an extra step to make this space beautiful and bring that sort of deco element into the space. And I think we're all benefiting from that now. When you're in the galleries, you kind of have the feeling that this is a space that someone really cared about and put some design thought into. This is the theater lobby. We call it the Baker Atrium. And because, as I was mentioning before, the architects designing the theater to express kind of the physical volume and shape of a theater, it meant that you could actually go underneath the seats, and the seats form this sort of diagonal form above you, and that also created this beautiful triangular space between the north face of the former administration building and the theater. And that opened up a 3-story high glass transparent plane where you can look out onto the campus. I mentioned that we excavated the entire space of the factory part of the printing plant, so where the printing presses were. That was about 20,000 square feet, and we excavated the whole thing to add 4 galleries, about 2,500 square feet each, as well as other amenities. And this is what the lower level galleries look like, that really give us, for the first time in our history, rectilinear galleries with white walls and 4 walls, actually. So very good for sort of conventional, in the best sense, displays of art. I didn't have a current live image of this, so I'm showing you a rendering of the artist's design for this space, which we call the Art Lab, which is also on the lower level. It's a drop-in, all-ages art-making space. So if you come to the museum on a Thursday or Friday evening, or all day Saturday and Sunday, you can make art yourself with anyone else who happens to have dropped by. It could be children, could be other grown-ups, could be all sorts of people, could be famous artists they're making art with free materials, and then people are encouraged to either take their work home or leave it there. So you'll see there's actually a display space where people can leave the art that they made. So this was a way that we thought to sort of fulfill that goal of becoming more engaged with our publics and making the museum a space that isn't just for passive appreciation, but also active creative engagement. Another kind of engagement, of course, is study and research. So the new building has 5 times as much space dedicated to collection access and education. We have 4 study centers on the lower level that are actually beneath the theater, and that sense of expressing the theater as a sculptural volume actually continues underneath it. So you can go underneath and you can see in this rendering the way that the theater seems to be hovering above these folks who are studying. So underneath the theater, we have a Works on Paper Study Center, Asian Art Study Center, a Film Library and Study Center, and a Conceptual Art Study Center. The cafe is one of the most dramatic spaces from a design perspective, and from that space, you have views down into the galleries, and you can see that the cafe itself, the kind of the architecture of it, is really very unusual and beautiful. This is now looking into that cantilever that goes out above the main entrance. You can see that there's a space for people to sit, and then you can look to the right or the left to the campus or the community. The film theater is a 230-seat theater. It's the first purpose-built cinema in our history. So even though we've been showing films for 50 years and we have the reputation for being one of the most, the best venues for cinema in the country, if not the world, we've gotten that reputation and done all those programs in spaces that were not designed for film. So the space on Bancroft Way, where we've been doing films for the past 10 years, was designed as a classroom. And we show films in there, and it was fine, but it wasn't designed to be ideally suited for film. So this project gave us the opportunity to design from scratch the best possible theater for film. So the film curators worked with film consultants, and so that everything from the angle of the seats to the quality of the sound, which was donated by Meyer Sound, a wonderful Berkeley firm, to the quality of the screen, everything is designed for the optimal experience of cinema. And it really is, I think, the best place to see a film now. So it's not surprising that we're selling out almost every screening. We just have unbelievable attendance, and have increased the number of screenings from about 380 a year to 450 a year. So we're doing multiple screenings, many nights, as well as matinees on Saturdays and Sundays. Our film program is just as diverse as our collection, so you can see everything from early silent film to experimental films from all over the world, new releases, Hollywood films. It's a great program. And there is the north side of the building. You can see there's the LED screen, 30-foot wide LED screen on the north side of the theater. And a lot of people say, so do you show on the outside the same thing as on the inside? I'm like, no, not exactly. We could, hypothetically, but that's not how it's intended. we actually can do lots of different things on this screen, and we're just beginning to sort of think through what the possibilities are. If you go by now, primarily what you'll see are promotional slides, sort of talking about what's on in the museum. But ultimately, we will be able to use this for films where the city hopefully will let us cross off that part of Addison, close off the street. We could have people bring their lawn chairs and watch Godzilla or King Kong or things like that. We can also potentially do other things that are more kind of community benefit, like maybe election night results, World Cup opera live from the Met. You know, there's really almost unlimited things we can do on this screen. It's just basketball players, I know, right? Yeah, maybe. So a little bit about our programs. Currently and through the end of May is a show that I organize called Architecture of Life, and if you haven't seen it, you really should go. Not because I organized it, but because it's filled with lots of art that is extremely wonderful and you'll never see again. There's many things in this show that are in the United States for the first and potentially last time. One of the real masterpieces in this show is this painting by Gustav Caillebotte. It's one of the great Impressionist paintings of the 19th century, and it's here till the end of May. It's a great painting. This painting enough would be reason to go to the museum, but there's about 279 other works in the show. The show is organized loosely around the theme of architecture. I wanted to do a show that celebrated the occasion of new architecture and which also underscored some of these unique qualities of our museum, which I've been talking to you about, including the encyclopedic nature of our collections and programs. So the show includes works from the past 2,000 years from all over the world. I wanted a show that also suggested the unique possibilities we have as the art museum of a great research university to connect to other disciplines. So the show includes, in addition to art and architecture, some amazing examples of scientific illustration, including things that were done on commission with scientists on the current UC faculty. The next big show that's opening this summer, as of July 13th, is the Berkeley Eye. And this is a show curated by Jacqueline Bass. Some of you may remember Jackie. She was the director of the museum in the 1990s. I asked her to come back and guest curate this exhibition. So she's selected over 100 of her favorite works from the collections, both Eastern and Western, and that'll fill up that main space on the ground floor. A really great chance to kind of reappreciate the depth and breadth of our collections. This is a painting, by the way, that is a recent acquisition. It's a painting by Sylvia Fine, who is an artist. I think she's 96. She lives in Crockett, and she is, or Clayton Martinez, something like that. Yeah, somewhere over there. It's all the same, right? Once you get past yeah. Martinez. But I think it's Clayton, actually. It's on the foothills of Mount Diablo. And she had a show recently at Crowswork Gallery in Oakland that was just such a revelation. Wonderful artist, a classmate of Anna Halprin in Wisconsin. And she's doing great work. Anna Mendita film. Many of you may know of Anna Mendita, a great Cuban-American artist, best known for her performance and photography. She was also very active making films that were originally screened in galleries, but this is the first comprehensive exhibition exploring her film work. So we'll have about 21 of her films in this exhibition. And then in early next year, a show that just had to come to Berkeley, Hippie Modernism. This is a show that actually originated at Walker Art Center in Minneapolis in association with BAMPFA. So we've been participating in the development of this show. And when it comes to Berkeley, we're going to expand it to sort of strengthen the local representation. It's a show that is the first comprehensive museum exhibition looking at the resonance of the counterculture in art, architecture, and design. So it's a very serious show, and I think one of the things that it does is really sort of turn on its head a lot of our assumptions about what hippies were or the impact that they had. So on the one hand, the show does include some psychedelic posters and those sorts of things, but it also shows the ways in which the counterculture had a tremendous impact on Silicon Valley and emerging new technologies. So there's many directions that the show goes that I think will be a real revelation to our audiences. We're planning a lot of public programs on the occasion of this show to give some of the people who were very active in this movement a chance to sort of pass along their wisdom to a new generation of people who are interested in these ideas and ideals. And I guess that's it. But I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much. So we've got about 8 or 10 minutes for questions, if anybody would like to ask anything. Yes? Well, that's a good question. The new building is actually 20% smaller than the old building. So you remember that Ito building would have been 40% larger than the old building. The new one is 20% smaller, so making me probably the first museum director in history to have a successful capital campaign for a smaller building. But, you know, it had to happen. So expanding, not for the foreseeable future. I think that if you go to the museum, nobody who goes there feels that it's smaller. Everyone goes, they're very surprised to hear that it's smaller. It feels big. It actually has just as much gallery space and more space for film programs. I think that it's the right size for us for now. In the long term, maybe looking out 10, 20 years, there is the possibility of expanding onto a parking lot that is adjacent to our property that's owned by the university. So that's something maybe for the next director to think about, but for the time being, we're good. Yeah.
How does one go about seeing the Japanese prints?
So if you can wait a year and a half, there will be an exhibition of focusing on the Japanese print collection. Our senior curator of Asian art is doing a series of 3 exhibitions, the first of which will be this summer, looking at the Chinese painting collection. Then the following year, a show looking at the Japanese collection, and the third year, a show looking at our Indian miniature collection. If you want to see something between now and then, and you have a sort of a legitimate scholarly purpose, you can make an appointment to go into our Asian Art Study Center and look at the materials there. Even if you don't have a legitimate scholarly purpose and are really persistent, you might be able to do it as well. Yes.
Excuse me. Do you have any plans on having a show for the artwork of indigenous peoples in this area?
Well, not specifically focused on the artwork of the indigenous peoples of this area. The current show, Architecture of Life, has about 20 baskets made by the Pomo Tribe, which is the tribe that lives just north of here in Sonoma, Mendocino, and Lake counties. And just this past Sunday, Susan Billy, who is a renowned Pomo basket maker, was at the museum doing a workshop on Pomo basket making. So that's up now if you'd like to see some very, very beautiful examples of indigenous art from this area. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. When do you anticipate the Hoffman collection going back up? And secondly, the current seating that's in the sort of pit area is very hard for seniors to access. And I wondered if you were going to be making any remediation in that.
So there is a small show of works from the Hoffman collection going up this summer. It's called Push and Pull. It's being organized by Lucinda Barnes. And that show will combine some of the highlights from our collection with a number of works borrowed from local collections. Lucinda is also organizing a Hoffman retrospective. It's the first retrospective that there's been in decades, and that will be probably in the spring of 2019, although it's not fixed on the calendar yet. There aren't currently any plans to make any major changes to any of the building. I mean, we've just finished building it, and we are sort of taking notes on things that need to be changed, and believe me, there are a lot of things in the file of notes. Most of the things have to do with signage, people not being able to find the bathroom, so we're sort of checking the stuff off as we can and as we can afford it. Structural changes to the forum are not going to happen anytime soon. You may remember... Well, we put in quite a number of benches in the galleries. We invested a bit of money and had commissioned benches for the galleries. We're putting Kaleidoscape in the Baker Atrium. You may remember from the old building, it was a kind of a seating sculpture that we commissioned for the atrium of the Bancroft Way building, kind of movable, modular furniture that you can sit on and stand on and all sorts of things. Anyway, that is going into the Baker Atrium. Yes. So yeah, I should have brought a picture of that. It's one of the really most wonderful features of the new building. Right when you come in the front door, there's a cascade of steps that goes down to the lower level. And that was designed and built by Paul Disco, who's a world-renowned Japanese joinery architect and designer, using wood from the trees that we had to cut down to build the theater. So you may recall when there was a parking garage there were some Canary Island pines. We had to cut them down. So he took that wood and turned it into this wonderful amenity, which can accommodate a bit over 100 people. And we've had many, many events there already, from poetry readings to dance recitals, concerts. It's really fantastic, and it can be used during the day just as a place for informal relaxation, and then at times as a kind of an auditorium. Yeah.
Do you have a plan to put artwork on the blank wall in the cafeteria?
The question is, do we have plans to put artwork on the blank wall in the cafeteria? Yes, we do, but it's taking some time. It takes some time to get it together, but we will eventually. Yeah, at least right now I like to think that the blank wall helps you to appreciate the architecture. You can't just put any art there. Obviously, it's not a gallery space, so you can't put the Pollock there or stuff like that, but something under glass would work, yeah. There, and then I think there was a question over there. What's going to happen to the old museum? Nobody knows, at least no one who I've talked to. There are these sort of built-in problems, if you will, that it needs to be seismically retrofit, and it is unique. I mean, it offers certain possibilities, but it's also limited. So there are conversations going on campus. I think that the goal is to preserve it in some fashion, but I don't think a decision has been made that I'm aware of. Yes? Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Well, our film curators do a really tremendous job of organizing things like retrospectives, and it's unbelievable, actually, that they're able to put together 450 screenings a year. It's an incredible achievement. I'm trying to think of some of the great things coming up. I think there's an Eisenstein retrospective coming up. So look forward to in the next couple of years, and many, many other things as well. San Francisco International Film Festival is coming up in the next couple of weeks. One more question? Yes.
Will you have contemporary music coming up with Terry?
Oh, yes. I'm glad you asked. So we decided to continue presenting contemporary music and other forms of live art, if you will. But we changed the model a little bit. In the former building, we called it Late, and it was sort of periodic, but not on a regular schedule. And it was really based on getting people like Terry Riley, who could attract many hundreds of people to fill that space. In the new building, because we don't have a 7,000 square foot atrium like we did in the other space, instead we have kind of a labyrinth with lots of small spaces. We've changed the model. And it's sort of based on what Sarah Cahill does at the Chapel of the Chimes every summer solstice, where she has multiple performances going on at the same time in the different crypts at the chapel. And so we've invited Sarah to do that, and the schedule is every full moon, and the program is called Full, so we never have to advertise. The moon does the advertising for us. So honestly, every full moon, if you have nothing else to do, come to the museum and there will be a music program, even if it's a day that we're closed. So if the full moon happens to be on a Monday or Tuesday, we have to open because the moon says so. So I think the next one is April 21st. Yes, so come to the museum April 21st, and you'll see some great live music in the evening. Great. Well, thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.